Okay, CM nail technique for Kalafi and Fulkerson and any other general surgeon. We're going to go through the steps necessary and we'll explain each one in detail. The CM nail stands for cephalomedullary nail, which is basically a fancy word for troch nail. And by definition, it means a nail that has an entry point at the tip of the troch. The first step for Kalafi and most surgeons is this 3.2 silver guide wire that they'll insert on wire driver down the tip of the canal. At this point, Kalafi will use the 8mm reamer and ream down just to open up the canal. Conversely, Fulkerson, as an alternative, will use a cannulated awl, long or a short one, to enter that same cavity. At this point, Kalafi will have reamed his 8mm canal. He'll take his guide wire out and he will put his guide wire down that comes on a T-handle. You have two options for guide wire. So he'll pass that guide wire all the way down to the tip of the femur, and we'll use our 2-piece depth gauge to get our size. This 2 pieces, it threads together, and it goes over your guide wire to tell you what size length of nail to use. At this point, you need to open up the proximal portion for the troch nail. This is a 16.5 reamer. Most surgeons know how deep to go, but technically speaking, it's the tooth just below the top of the reamer that'll sit on the top of the troch. And to back up, Fulkerson uses this right out of the gate. So his steps will be awl and then this big reamer, where Kalafi will go guide pin, 8mm reamer, and then ultimately flexible reaming. So at this point, the surgeon will start flexibly reaming, in this case a long nail. We'll know our length of our nail based on our depth gauge. Our nails that we have in our territory have 2 different angles, 125 and 130, which you'll see on the guide, and they're left and right specific. So once he's reamed down the canal, he'll over-ream typically by 1mm, so you'll decide the diameter of the nail at that point. This is your guide. To insert the nail, you'll use one locking bolt, goes down the top. We find it's easiest to lock it down with this blue kind of bullet tip screwdriver to tighten down this bracket. It also has an impactor pad that'll screw onto the top here, which I'm going to take off for technique purposes. You have your nail loaded. It's always a good idea to confirm your angle. So you have 2 cannulas in the set, the outer cannula and the inner cannula that's used for the guide pin. These snap together, they don't screw together, and they'll go up the guide, in this case a 130, and we'll be able to tell with our long guide wire if it passes through the nail. At this point, you're ready to take this off and put the nail down the canal, like so. So at this point, we're going to prepare our lag screw that'll go up the femoral canal. In this case, again, we're going to use a 130. It's worth backing up. For Kalafi only, there's a trocar point that they'll use before this cannula. It etches the bone to help guide the guide pin in the correct location. So he'll just tap that in, etch the bone, and take it out. At this point, you'll wire drive the long gold tip guide pin up the canal and through the femoral head. They'll take multiple x-rays to make sure it's going to the center head, and it's worth noting that our lag screws, wherever that guide pin sits, our lag screw oftentimes sits a bit higher, so when in doubt, cheat this guide wire lower than the center of the femoral head. At this point, the inner bushing comes out to only leave the guide wire left up into the canal. You use this gold depth gauge that goes over the guide wire to get your length of both your drill and your actual lag screw. So in this case, let's say it was a 90. You'll set your reamer with a stop that comes separate to a 90mm lag screw and drill up into the canal. At this point, you'll attach your lag screw, which is 3 pieces and very important. Here's your lag screw inserter. You can see it has threads here. This is called a compression device. It's imperative that you have this loaded prior to putting your lag screw on. Furthermore, in order to lock the lag screw onto your lag screw inserter, you have this locking piece that goes down the tip that has threads, and it'll lock onto the lag screw. Keep in mind, when you open your lag screw, it'll come with a separate set screw that you need to not throw out and we'll use at a later time. At this point, you have your lag screw locked. you'll send it up the canal over the guide pin and into the bone. As an alternative, if there's hard bone, there's also a tap that can be used. So at this point, you have your lag screw up into your canal. You can unscrew it here, take your lag screw off, and at this point, you can take everything out. Depending on their timing, this is also the time that they'll insert the set screw that was packaged with the lag screw. Most people call this the whirly bird. It's just a flexible piece. It can go down the tip with that set screw all the way down and screw into the top of the lag screw, which allows the screw to either not slide or rotate or both. An item of note, you see this is an alternative cannula that Coffee oftentimes likes to use. He calls it the double barrel. You can see that there's an extra stymon pin that you can put up the canal. It sits loose in the bottom of the trays, and Coffee will oftentimes ask for it. So at this point, you have your lag screw up the canal, you have your set screw. Now you've got to do your distal screws, which you can either do a short nail or a long nail. Oftentimes we're doing a long nail. It's a little bit counterintuitive. So long nail, you just need a 4-3 drill bit, a short depth gauge, and a screwdriver either on power or hand that'll go down to these unguided distal screws. If you use a short nail, which is why I say it's converse, you use the long instrumentation. So similar to the lag screw, these are green and red cannulas that, again, lock in. They don't screw in, but they lock in. They slide through the guide and into which will line it up to the distal holes of the short nail. Same as the same diameter 4-3 drill bit. You'll drill both cortices, which you can read off of the drill bit itself, or use a long depth gauge. Once you've determined your size of your screw, you can pull the inner cannula out and insert your screw with a long driver either on power or hand. An item of note that there's a black etch line on the long driver, which will represent the fully seating of your screw based on your depth gauge and cannula. You can do 2 screws there. At this point, you can take it out. You can take your nail out in the same fashion with your rounded tip drill bit, or excuse me, screwdriver. And lastly, it's worth noting that some surgeons will use an end cap. This is your end cap inserter. You can see it's toothed on the edge. It also has, much like the lag screw, a locking device that'll lock it on to the end cap, which you can insert through the guide if you're using a 0mm end cap. If you're using something thicker, you're gonna have to take the guide off and then insert the end cap. That's it.